After all this, you still...
I still want that gas, yes. And you had better deliver.
Welcome back to the greenhouse, dear listeners. With me today is friend of the show, Anand, and we'll be getting into a bit of a discussion on the results of the recent Indian parliamentary elections. Anand, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good, haven't really been doing much lately, but right now I feel good. I feel very excited about doing this podcast.
Hell yeah, hell yeah. So I guess let's just get right into the meat of it, right? So there's a lot of like what I can only consider to be froth or like kind of frivolous analyses or perspectives from particularly Western observers when it comes to deciphering or commenting on Indian politics and Indian elections. And fortunately, because I'm not as online as I used to be, I've been seeing less of that, but periodically that'll cross over into my feed or any of the Discord servers I'm on. People will talk about some of these bad takes and stuff, right? So what do Western observers tend to get wrong about India, both in general, but also with recent trends with regards to things like go ahead, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, well, I think in general is they often forget just how like crazy diverse India is, right? I think they have this like mindset, and partially it's because like obviously who they meet in like the West who is Indian, right? They'll say like, oh, they're just like they're all from UP or they're all from Gujarat. All Indians in India are like that. All Hindus in India are like that, right? They
Right.
don't understand obviously the linguistic differences, the cultural differences, the religious differences that go throughout like the entire country, right? Like it's like a Hindu in Tamil Nadu is not in it's like very different than like a Hindu in like UP, right?
Right.
Very
Right.
different types, like the way they practice, the way they think, the way they do things. Like it's very different. I mean, obviously you have similarities, but like there's a lot of differences there. Right? I think that's like the first thing they often forget.
Yeah, I think with regards to social dynamics in the Indian context, I think Western observers really oversimplify or try to find parallels with their own context, right? But like you were pointing to, the context of social dynamics in India is so much more complex and diverse, not just along things like religion and regionality, but even with additional markers of identity like caste, regional formation, and even from region to region, there are just factors that play out in the political economy of each region of India, right? Like South India's political economy is I mean, it's not just marginally, it's by a factor of almost 1,000, right? It's completely different from North India. West and East India are also completely different in those regards. And even, among members of the same party, right? I'm sure the BJP is going to come up in our discussion. The regional interests that play out from like some of the newer cadre of the BJP in like the East is markedly different from like that of the Hindi belt, for example.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right about that. And I think in general, like the why, like let's say somebody is a member of the BJP, like now is very different. Like a new member is like very different than like why somebody was like a part of the BJP from like the very beginning when it first formed in 1980. Right?
Right.
Like various interests have suddenly like have come together for some people and say this is why I'm joining the BJP. This is why I'm joining. Obviously, like I mean, like I am assuming the show will like at least if we're on a podcast like this, I'm assuming everybody kind of knows where politics are at. Right? And obviously, it's shitty to like be a member of the BJP in any way possible. But like there are like different reasons. It's not just like all I hate Muslims. I want to kill them all. Of course, many members of the BJP are like that, but some members are like, you know what? I'm willing to deal with this crazy anti-Muslim thing because I like their pro-business
It,
business friendly type of politics they push forward, right?
and more than that too, like we'll get into some of this, like they had this kind of mandate or interest from a certain segment of voters because of the reputation and legacy of corruption within other political factions, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
This idea that they could capitalize on being quote unquote less corrupt appealed to people in 2014, right?
Oh, no, yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I think like there's this kind of like feeling of just uh like dynastic politics in India, right? Where like it
Hmm.
just feels like the same families are just dominating Indian politics, especially with regards to INC, where the Nehru Gandhi family has just been on the scene forever, and people were like, you know what, like I want something new, I want something different. Like I know this is kind of like a cliche that's repeated over and over again, like in all types in all types of countries around the world. It's definitely repeated like a lot, I would say, in the US, but to a certain extent it is very true, and I think in India especially it was very true. Like people were like looking at, do I want Rahul Gandhi, this like nepo baby fail son who hasn't done shit, or
Hmm.
do I want Modi, who seems to have like very humble backgrounds. He was a chaiwala. He was this. He was that. You know what? I think I want Modi. Right? That was kind of like the mindset that like a lot of people had.
Let's get into Modi just a bit too, because he's become the kind of international face of Indian politics, right? And Hindutva has also become a bit of a buzzword among Indian observers of politics, right? So, what are Western observers getting wrong about Hindutva, or what are they getting wrong about Modi when they look at him as the face of it?
Well, I think one thing is that Hindutva has been around since the early 20th century as a movement, right? And even then, it's like ideological origins has precursors before that, right? Because I think a
Hmm.
lot of Western observers seem to think is it started with Modi, which is ridiculous because he's not even the first
Hmm.
BJP prime minister we've had, right? It was Vajpayee
Right.
was the first one, right? And this has been a movement that has been building steadily for like since independence, in trying to like make these like footholds in like the sort of state apparatus of India, right? And trying to like push forward their policies. They've had like major victories here and there. They've had major losses here and there. Like their first major victory was, I think, when they were able to kind their precursor before it was like called the BJP. They had a different party that was kind of like the political arm of the RSS, which is for those who don't know, is like the fascist paramilitary organization in India, right? And they were able to get in government after the emergency, after they ousted Indira Gandhi, right? That was considered to be like one of the first major victories of the Hindutva movement, right? And that was kind of like
Hmm.
what they saw as the rise of like many of the modern members like LK Advani and Vajpayee, right? And for those who don't know, LK Advani would be the one who was kind of spearheaded the Ram Mandir movement, which I'm sure we'll
Yeah.
be talking about later in this episode.
Yeah, I kind of like to think of LK Advani as like the Indian Mitch McConnell, but that's still not a fair comparison. But it's
I don't know. I feel like he's more of a Newt Gingrich type of dude.
yeah, yeah, that's more fair. That's more apt. And I think I've also just shouted out this book several times before, and I think this is just a good forum to do it as well. Is Kaushiki Dasgupta's book, Sadhus in Hindu Politics, right? And it kind of explores the dynamic formation of Hindutva in the same context. And I think certain scholars, I don't think are wrong to label it as a form of fascism, or certain scholars, like in trying to appeal to Western observers, refer to it as ultra right or fascist. And there are parallels there. There's reasons for that. But I think it kind of papers over this emergent dynamic of it being this kind of like triumvirate between like religious forces, political actors, and then business capital, right? And that's kind of like the thesis of the book overall. It's a bit of a dry academic read, but it's worth checking out if you need like an academic presentation of the same framework. But you are right that it's much more multifaceted than just Western style ultra nationalist, ultra right politics. And even then it's not simple in the Western context either.
And I also think what's interesting is that like even then the BJP, there's like a lot of similarities I think you can draw with like the fascist party in France led by Le Pen, right?
Hmm.
Where for like a while, like the big rallying cry of like many of the fascists in India, the BJP, like diehard members of the BJP was they wanted protectionist economic policies, right?
Right.
Like that was like the thing they were like going to live and die for. It's like if it's not going to be protectionist, if it's not going to be as they call it India first, then what the fuck are we even doing here? And I think you see kind of how like many like members in power in BJP, they've kind of had a sacrifice here and there because like as you know, like Vajpayee and Modi, they're very much not protectionist, right? At least in their economic policies, they're just your regular old-fashioned. Especially Modi, he's just a neoliberal. You look at
Right.
many of his policies, it's just like, oh, this guy's just a neoliberal, right? There's nothing like new or special about that.
So within the context of this like global resurgence, I don't know if that's the right word, of like the right wing around the world in various governments, right? The BJP kind of fits into that global wave to some extent. What's necessary for outside observers to understand about that?
Well, I mean, I guess in terms of how it fits in the global wave, I think people need to understand that it is the largest fascist movement in the world. You know, because obviously India is the largest population, but like the amount of support like the BJP has had in like I think obviously amongst the populace, but in like also consolidating power with via like the laws they've passed, where they've been able to consolidate the media in their favor. It's just like it's insane just how fast they worked. Right? I don't really think you can see any other. I would say, at least, and obviously there are examples here and there that people will pick and choose from. But like the amount of just like you see bootlickers now. Like in Indian media of the BJP is just absolutely crazy. Like I mean,
Yeah.
like almost every major they call it Godi media, by the way, for
Yeah.
those who like it's just insane. Like the average fucking like news like paper, the average like news show, like there's a solid chance they're either like Modi sympathetic or just full blown like Modi supporters.
That's an observation I've shared as well, and this is something that like I guess when you have like some of the cultural context or you have some of the anecdotal experience, you can speak to it a little more clearly than some outside observers can, right? But something that tracks with the Indian right, is and I don't know if it's because the internet has penetrated, Indian social life more, or if like people are more online, or if, all media profit seeking ventures tend towards the same objectives, right? It's playing out a lot like culture war, like, the way the culture war is prosecuted in the media in the West, right? You kind of have this um loyal media apparatus that props up the party line. And even if they're not directly doing it, they do the job of discouraging and disparaging the left more broadly in India, right? And I think in addition to this exacerbation of culture war issues under, I know that's like a Western framework to place on it, right? But just the way that like sectarian tensions have kind of been exacerbated under this regime, right? Or the way that the left has been suppressed in certain ways, or that any argument against these perspectives or frameworks is maligned and disparaged, right? It fits into similar formations we see around the world to some extent. And that's just my
Yeah,
observation. I don't know if I'm.
oh yeah, I think you're making sense. I think you're absolutely right about that. And I especially like how you brought up kind of like the culture war, right? Because like I think like I mean, if you guys think like right-wing media in like America is bad, oh boy, you haven't seen
Yeah.
anything yet. Oh my God. It's like, hey, you know how like you like right-wing media, like to put an example, like let's say famous movie came out 2023, this movie called Pathan, right? It was considered to be like a
Yeah.
huge blockbuster with Shah Rukh Khan, right? Like so you know how like in like the West in America, like right-wing media goes batshit crazy over like anytime, oh, there's a gay character, oh, grooming, like all
Right.
that type of stuff. So there was like this scene in Patan. It was a song, and this like girl, she's like Deepika Padukone's character. She's like dancing, quote unquote, suggestively, as they would say, and she's like wearing, I think, a saffron or like a somewhat saffron colored like bathing suit. And oh my God, the amount of shit that just came out of that. Oh my God, it was crazy. And for those who don't know, saffron is like considered to be like a quote unquote like sacred color, I guess, in Hinduism for some reason. I
But
mean,
Hindu nationalist parties and operators will wear saffron as like their,
yeah, like
identifier as well.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, I mean, I actually don't know how much it has to do with Hinduism. Maybe I have to look into that, but it's just kind of become like a huge nationalist thing at this point, especially amongst the fascists. And they just like, it was like the amount of like coverage and like media that came from that. I was like, seriously? Like,
There's a
I
lot
was so
of like
confused.
outrage culture has only gotten worse, right? Because I mean, people might remember like the controversy about Padmavat, if anyone remembers that.
Oh my God. It was such a, the movie was like everything right wingers would love too. It
I
was
mean,
such like a,
that's what I don't get about Sanjay Leela Bhansali, right? Because it's like he makes the movies they want, and it's not enough for them, you know?
like Padmavat was like really egregious. Like it was like, oh, it was the righteous Hindu king with his very what they say, what's the term? Like very pure Hindu wife, right? And he was
Right.
fighting the despicable Muslim barbarian who was like portrayed in every way possible to look like a barbarian. You know, like he was everything the right wingers would have like loved, but there was just like this rumor where it was like, oh, there's going to be like a Hindu queen, having a relationship with like a Muslim king, and everybody just went like absolutely crazy. It was insane.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, and even then, like along that, like some of that content, like it'll get into my feed as well, and like one of these weirdo comments I've been seeing a lot lately, right, is this allegation from right wingers in India of like what they call Urdu wood or like Muslim wood for like Bollywood. And it's like it reads the same as like right wing Americans talking about, the Jews control Hollywood type of narrative, right? It's the same like playbook but for the Indian context. And the only time I can think about this too is like this was a long time ago. I think like closer to like maybe 2016 or so when I was visiting family in India, right? And a relative was basically talking about India's version of affirmative action, so the reservation system in this case, right? And all the critiques this person had of the system, I'm like, I've heard these in English from Fox News hosts before. What the fuck? So there
Oh
is
no,
this
yeah.
like global right wing playbook. I don't know if it's that organic or if it's that organized or whatever the case is, but they speak the same they say the same words in different languages. I'm starting to feel like.
Oh no, yeah, you can like again, much as I like, say I don't really think you can draw a comparison, here or there, or it's like one to one, especially with the West. There are definitely many things you can like draw comparisons with, and I think especially if you look at the ideological origins of like Hindutva, then you'll see, oh yeah, no, you can definitely draw comparisons. Because keep in mind, many of the sort of people who kind of like are what they would call like the ideological like founders of the movement, like Savarkar, Golwalker,
Yeah.
Hedgewog, right? These guys like they took direct inspiration from like fascist movements in Europe, right?
Yeah.
So like this whole thing like where they said, oh, like I think it was Golwalker, I believe, yeah, Golwalker who said, well, I think we should like emulate what the Germans did to the Jews, we should emulate that with the non-Hindus, right? We should emulate that with the Christians and the Muslims, right? And he kind of drew like direct comparisons saying we have to maintain ethnic purity, things like that. So like you could see like we need to draw comparisons when they're necessary, but I would also hesitate to do it when it just feels like, all right, you're reaching here and you just want to do a one for one when it's just not a one for one. You cannot find a one for one for that.
Yeah, it's like a branch off of the same tree, but it's not a one to one like you're saying. And it's funny you bring that up because like the same people who hold, Savarkar, Golwalkar et al. in esteem, right? These are the same people who love to say, well, we were the tolerant ones. We let all these people in, why are you deeming us as intolerant? It's funny how they kind of play both sides of it, right?
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And I think especially it's like then they'll always go with the, oh, but how can I be Islamophobic when I allow all these Muslims to live within our borders? That's really
Yeah, yeah.
right. It's like that, or they'll say, hey, if the Muslims don't like our policies you're pushing forward here, why don't they go to Pakistan, right? It's like it's kind of like they go back and forth on it. It's kind of it's almost a catch-22, right? You're damned if you do get them on this, and you're damned if you don't, right?
Yeah, like it's just typical right wing brain. I don't know how else to describe it. On that note too, have you ever read George Jackson's Blood in My Eye?
I've read like bits and pieces of it.
Okay, so there's a segment in Blood in My Eye where he's talking about this internationalist character of fascism, right? And how like it's propping up around the world and they're starting to mirror each other from country to country. And for him to observe that in his point in history is very prescient, right? But I think it's what he says it's in response to. The reason why we're seeing this resurgence of fascism around the world is because it's chasing behind the left. You know, where the left just was, fascism is running right there. And for him to talk about it in the context of, US intervention is one thing then, right? But if you think about it in the Indian context, right, India is not this inherently right-wing only space. It's not this inherently reactionary space like it's sometimes made out to be. I don't think any space is entirely like that, right? But you had like a major thrust of the third worldist movement coming out of India. You have very strong traditions of Marxism, socialism, labor, and farmers movements across the country, right? So India has its own vibrant and diverse left tradition, but I think, as has been the case for the left around the world, for a variety of reasons, those forces have not been able to coalesce around the right in the way the right has been able to coalesce around the left, And that understanding is a lot more useful to examining the current state of politics around the world than just inherently writing places off. I don't know. That's just me.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And I think that like talking about like the history of communism in India and Marxism and kind of like that sort of tradition in India, like I think I would like I mean I already know like talking to like a lot of like Western communists and like American communists, like they don't really know much about the history of India, right? And the history of like communism in India. And like I'm not surprised, right? I mean, nor am I like going to judge them for that. Like that's just like common, what I find
I could
common.
stand
Like
in
they don't really
there
know.
too, exactly. Yeah. So like
Yeah, but like it's really interesting, especially reading about it amongst in the presence of like the independence movement, right? And
yeah.
just like this idea they had of like, independent India, like especially a lot of the communists in like the early 20th century, right? When they kind of were like, it was really interesting reading about like what their idea of like an independent India would be, how like all the ethnicities and like the would live amongst each other with all the linguistic diversity. Like they were imagining this like very interesting sort of utopic idea of India. And I think to see what happened, obviously with partition and then with all this just horrible thing that happened like 20 years afterwards with like,
Yeah.
with the genocide in Bangladesh, right? It just seems like such a like spin in the face to them, right? And it almost makes me want to cry, right? They
Hmm.
imagine this really beautiful place, but it just, it couldn't. And perhaps it was them. I'm never going to like say like I'm never going to be one of those people who says, "Oh, partition was inevitable," because I think that's a stupid position to hold. It was not inevitable, right? And I think to say that, you kind of just write off like all the deaths that happened and all like the ethnic cleansing that happened as like, oh, they had to happen, right? And I think that's a really horrible thing to say, obviously, but it's just it also has no basis in fact. Partition did not have to happen. It was being pushed by the worst
Hmm.
people. In fact, the people who did support partition, it was the fascists. The fascists, they support partition. They thought it was a great idea.
And I think that's the legacy of partition, right? Everything comes from the pain wrought of those moments, and then just the ripples of that through the present. And there's people who observe, from outside India who don't understand that. There's people in the diaspora who don't understand how partition may have directly impacted them or their families, and why that plays out not only in a political context, but in terms of like family trauma or family like dynamics, how that's had an effect. People don't understand that. And I think the Indian right has kind of capitalized both on the pain of the amnesia, but also exploits the contradictions from that, right? And I think they really do thrive on this idea of, You remember the last time you trusted them? That's what happened. And that needling, is kind of like what the global right offers the world, right? Is don't trust people, don't try anything, everyone's going to hurt you, and they will invoke people's most painful memories, not as a way to motivate them to do better, or not as a way to explain the sources of their pain, but as the very reason why they can never hope for anything to change. Anyhow.
Yeah, exactly. It's this idea of kind of like giving into everybody's like worst like nature and saying this is why we have to exist, right? Because
Yeah.
we have to exist because the world is like they create this fantasy of a world, right? And then they say this is why we need to be because of this, and they point to the fantasy, you know. So it's kind of why it's not really used to debating them because of course you're going to lose to them because you're trying to explain them outside of the fantasy, but they've created the fantasy themselves, and they just have to convince
Exactly.
people. Right, and I mean, I don't know. I feel like I've been rambling a little bit so far in this podcast, to the point where I may not be making a whole lot of sense. And for the
That is the
listeners,
whole point of this show. If people continue to listen to the show, it's because of the rambling.
yeah, for the listeners, I apologize.
No need. So speaking of broken fantasies, right? Let's talk about the BJP's alleged pledge of Char Sopar, or getting 400 seats, right? That campaign didn't actually make any net gains. So at least at the when I came up with the concept for this recording, forming a government was going to be a tricky affair for Modi. Have they been able to form the government yet, or is that still underway?
I think it's pretty much like almost it's like pretty much official now. They will be able to form a government with, I believe, the NDA getting 293 seats, or is it 290?
So
It's 293, 294, something like that.
yeah, so basically for those of the listeners who don't understand the parliamentary math for this, right? The BJP's, wins in yesteryear, right? In 2019, it was able to obtain 303 seats, right? So with that, it kind of gets past the mathematical majority and can kind of act independently of its allies or its opposition. With the new results, the BJP itself has only obtained 240 seats, and its allies obtained 53. So it's still over the mathematical majority, but now it's had to make concessions to its allies. So let's maybe just get into the NDA itself, right? So there were a lot of jokes about this when the negotiations were still going underway. Like, did you see this comment from Nitish Kumar? He was telling Modi to hurry up on forming the government, which is it's funny as hell. Where it's basically like, I just saw a lot of memes of like Modi and Amit Shah like running to Bihar to beg Nitish Kumar to give him the seats needed for the alliance, right? So yeah, there were a couple articles about this last week. This is from June 6th. This is now from actually, yeah, these are both from June 6th. Yeah, so basically, the two key regional allies the BJP would need are two regional parties. So this would be Nitish Kumar's Janta Dal from Bihar.
To be clear, it's Janta Dal United. JDU.
That's true. That's true.
There are numerous Janta Dal parties, or have been named Janta Dal in the history of India. I feel like we should clarify.
The JDU specifically in this case, right? Yeah, and then you also have Chandrababu Naidu's Telugu Desam party. So both are regional formations, more specifically, Andhra Pradesh and Bihar, respectively. And I think, what is it? So altogether, the NDA will have 293 seats. So that's above the mathematical majority of 272. But what's not clear to me yet is what kind of concessions Modi will have to make to his regional partners.
I believe and maybe this has changed, but the rumor that I was seeing recently was that they don't want Amit Shah in the government. So who knows where that goes? Uh, I haven't really been seeing much lately. I'm going to be honest. I think like for a while, especially like after the election results came out, like a lot of people were saying, "Oh, who knows? Maybe the INC could sway away, the JDU or the TDP." But if they formed a government, they went into the NDA alliance with their eyes wide open, right? They knew what they were getting. I have a hard
Yeah,
time believing that like the India or like INC could like offer them anything that would sway them away, right? Because like I
didn't
think was
JDU
it?
leave the INC
Sorry, go ahead.
alliance? I'm just saying that, like, yeah, the JDU left the INC alliance to go partner up with the BJP, if I understand that correctly.
But yeah, they left like last year too. Like I
Yeah.
believe like 2020. So it's like this idea that maybe we could get them to come. It's like, well, what are you going to offer them, right? Because like they like, and it's very clear, like especially the TDP, like they do not like Modi. They do not like the BJP at all. But there is a reason they're like, you know what? I'm willing to tolerate it because my interests align with them, right? And the TDP specifically is a pro-business party. It is a party that just mainly it's a regional business party that's just mainly likes the fact that Modi and the BJP in general try and promote like investment from like foreign corporations into India, right? That's like one of the big reasons why the TDP aligned with the BJP, right? Because for those of you who don't know, uh, on the, like especially like there are many cities recently in like the Telugu states, Andhra and Telangana, which have like kind of became like major tech sectors recently,
Yeah.
right? And they're trying to capitalize on that.
Understandably so, and I think because of like that new influx of tech money, they've been able to build up their infrastructure and standing within the Indian context, right? So they want to make good on their investments. I think this is from Reuters. The big thing here is that, to form their government, they need to rely on their allies in the TDP and JDU respectively. And from what it's looking like, the TDP probably needs in exchange for the support, which supports those business objectives like you mentioned. And with Kumar's strategic positioning, going from the INC back to the BJP, assuming the JDU is probably going to ask for a couple cabinet spots, maybe a couple key ones. I would reckon, in exchange for the support. It would be smart to request that.
Yeah, and again, I just want to reiterate, like like especially the TDP, they do not like the BJP at all. They do not like Modi at all,
Yeah.
right? I think Chandra Babu didn't he make a comment like a few years ago saying like, every leader in the world is better than Modi or whatever, something like that. Like, or was that either it was the Chandra Babu or it was Kumar? I can't remember which one it was. I remember reading it, but like, so they like again, like they went into this alliance with their eyes wide open. They don't like them, but they saw, listen, our interests align here, and this is why we're going to stick with the alliance. Whereas our interests do not align anymore with the INC or any of the other parties in the India alliance, so we're not going to go with them, right? So I think people just need to be prepared that I don't think uh the government in the next few years will fall apart because of either the TDP or the JDU. But hey, who knows? Maybe I'll be wrong.
Yeah. And again, it's up to Modi to not fumble the bag, and let's see how that goes. Yeah, I think if just to clarify from the article, right? So besides special status and cabinet positions, the TDP is also seeking more projects in Andhra Pradesh and to complete the building of its new capital, Amravati. Two sources familiar with the matter told. This is not the first time we are in the NDA, so we are confident that we will get what is due to us, a TDP spokesperson said. Quote, in our earlier terms with the NDA, we held ministerial berths and also the lower house Speaker Party. This time we are a strong partner and share a clear vision for the country. she said. JDU's Kumar also wants support for new Bihar, along with federal cabinet positions, one NDA source said. Well, I guess it's up to Modi to make sure he keeps those partners happy, right?
There's no way he's not going to go for it. Like he's gonna,
Yeah.
he absolutely has to.
And I think it doesn't, bother his neoliberal agenda. What I think that does play against examples of this, where like the BJP will go in like will disappoint the hardline Hindus, right? So I'm not sure how that plays out in practice, but that how it plays out dynamically, who knows?
Yeah.
So just another thing, right? So for their strategy. So I think especially in recent, right? The BJP is relying on Uttar Pradesh to go hard for it. And if anyone needs a breakdown of the electoral math, basically the way you could look at Uttar Pradesh is like, I don't know. Imagine if Mississippi had California's electoral votes. That's a very rough like analogy for like people who don't get like, need an immediate American comparison. But I think like,
I get what you're saying, but
yeah,
no, I
it's the
understand what
most
you're saying,
populous state. It's just a weird analogy for it, but like that's one way to somebody, and they're like, "Oh, that's what it's like." But yeah, it's the most populous state. It holds 80 legislative seats, so it's key to any election victory, right? So
wait.
they were
I also wanted to.
yeah.
Sorry. I just hate to interrupt you, but I also wanted to, because we kind of passed it, but I kind of wanted to share this. I'm sure, Adi, you've seen this tweet as well. But like somebody was trying to explain, like if American elections were more like Indian elections, we'd have the Democrats forming a coalition government with a party called Machete del Pueblo that has a vice grip on South Central LA's Chicanos. Oh, and it's headed by Danny Trejo. And I feel like
No, for real.
And for those of you who don't get like the Danny Trejo part, like especially in South India, like a lot of the leaders of these parties are former actors.
Yeah. Yeah, they put the Neta in Abhineta for those of you who get it.
Yeah. I don't know, I
Um,
saw that. Ever since I saw that, it's just been killing me. And it's so
oh
true.
my
It's like
god,
weirdly
it's so
accurate.
true. It's so true. And we'll probably get into this. I want to share like the maps. I don't know if I'm going to be able to share that as part of the recording. I don't want to make a video, to be honest, but I'll probably add a link of the article that breaks down the results 19 versus 2024. So yeah, in 2019, Uttar Pradesh went hard for, but this cycle we saw the breakthrough of the INC and Samajwadi parties along with other factions, Uttar Pradesh as well as Rajasthan, Maharashtra, and elsewhere. So has the reliance on the Hindi belt and to a particular cohort of Hindu voters failed or hit its upper limit for the BJP? And how do you expect this to play out?
Well, I mean, yeah, it very obviously has hit its upper limit because, like, I don't really know how you could have like gone anywhere but down, especially after the results of like 2019, where they just completely dominated like all those like states in the Hindi belt, right? And to be fair, like, don't get it wrong, like these states like still for the most part do have like as like in terms of state governments, they still have BJP state governments, right? Like Rajasthan still BJP like state, technically UP still BJP state. It's just in these last elections, clearly it did not fucking work. Like the usual kind of playing to that sort of demographic in order to get the vote, it did not work. And you could kind of see it that the BJP started freaking out towards like uh towards the end there, especially in like in the middle of like the heat of the election voting, they were freaking out. Like Modi was going from like state to state in the north, like giving like very how should I say even more Hitler-esque speeches than usual, where he kept on saying, "Oh, the INC, they'll take your jobs, they'll give it to the Muslims, they'll kill your children," like all of that kind of usual stuff, right? But I guess the reason why it didn't work this time, it's because he kept on doing the whole "they'll give your jobs to Muslims," but the problem is, what jobs? They don't have jobs. The unemployment
Exactly,
is like sky high.
exactly.
this shit doesn't work when like that like you cannot do that if there is nothing to be taken away. Life already sucks, and how could they take anything away? I got nothing, right? That was kind of like, especially like so this whole like playing to like that sort of mindset, right? Like that mindset of being fearful of like Indian minorities. It didn't work the same way it did in the last two times.
Exactly. Like, I think so far you can get with that. And for them to, I mean, of course, it's like, something you're just saying as a slogan to get people riled. Like, how could you realistically expect 400 electoral seats with the same strategy?
Especially,
And I
and the
mean,
thing is, go ahead.
oh, I was just gonna get into like, like really appealing to the Hindi belt and North Indian Hindus as like their major constituency, right? As we're seeing, with the fallout of how the implementation of the Ram Mandir, like those policies did not win over the vast majority of over people outside a certain voting block, right? So for them to get punished for that, I think is a good thing, right? But at the same time, it's like, how did they not see this coming?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think a lot of people were thinking, oh, they're going to use the Ram Mandir the way they used the Kashmir issue back in 2019, right? Because like Modi just used the hell out of that. The BJP in general, they were able to pretty much ride it to like a huge, landslide victory, right? And I think the problem is that it was just like because the Ram Mandir happened all the way back in January, right?
Right.
The inauguration of it, and the election is in May. It is hard to continue up like to play that up for 4 straight months, right?
Right.
You cannot. It's just not possible for them to do that. And at some point, and I was reading a lot of interesting articles where like people were interviewing voters, right? And the general vibe of it was like, I'm kind of sick of all this like religion and politics stuff. I kind of just care about jobs, right? I kind of care about the fact that it's kind of hard to get food on the table. Right. I mean, I hate to be like, I know that's like a cliche and it's like really corny, but like to a certain extent, that stuff does matter. Right. And that's
And
what I
that's
think the
what's
average
happening to people
sorry, go
right
ahead.
now. Yeah. I was just saying that's what people are dealing with.
Yeah, exactly. And like a lot of people were just saying, I've been told the economy is great, but like I don't have a job, or I'm not getting paid enough, and the prices for everything is sky high, right? It's just it cannot you to a certain extent, I think it shows that material interest at some point will play a hand, even when the BJP tried so hard to like play to communalism, and specifically kind of the fear that many Hindus unfortunately have of Muslims, especially in the Hindi belt.
Right. And I think another thing too is like some of the takes and discourse I've seen in the aftermath of this, right? Like from the Indian right is like it's almost like blaming Ayodhya's Hindus. So this is where they built the temple, right? For being ungrateful or for not like, owing everything they have to the BJP at that point, right? And it's kind of like, dude, like even if there's a vocal plurality of people who wanted this to happen, that's not everybody who votes, right? That's not the only thing they care about, right? And for this idea that like we gave you the temple, aren't you happy? I don't think it's fair to, one use religion as a tool to shame people in any context, right? But then also this idea that because you didn't then give your votes to the BJP in exchange for this happening, your faith is called into question, your loyalty to the country is now called into question, and this idea that you owed the BJP your vote is insane.
Yeah, and I also this may be a little bit off topic, but like I know we've been talking about it outside of this podcast as well. We're talking about like, oh, the secular Hindus really screwed us over. That's why the
Yeah,
BJP didn't do so
yeah.
well,
Oh my god,
right? But
I
what's
saw
funny,
so many quotes of people like out of context posting Savarkar being like, "I'm not scared of Muslims. I'm scared of Hindus who hate Hindus." I'm like, name five. Name five.
no, but the crazy thing is, like, Savarkar himself, he was a secular Hindu. He called himself like he would pretty much call himself probably a secular Hindu, right? Many of the like the most fascistic people I meet who will like they will always say, I am a secular Hindu, and it'll be followed by like the most Hitlerite stuff you'll ever hear, right? So this idea that it's like, oh, these secular Hindus are screwing us over, it's like, no, it's not. It's like, come on.
Yeah, and it's I don't know this other idea that just like Uttar Pradesh betrayed us. Uttar Pradesh betrayed you. Let's be clear: the state with like the biggest stereotype of criminals, thugs, scammers, liars, and generally being dishonest. Those are the people you put your faith in. And I can say it. I'm from Uttar Pradesh. I got the UP pass. I got the Gaon pass to say it. But at the same time, come on, man. Like you thought people from Uttar Pradesh were honest? Be real.
Yeah, and I think something interesting that also happened this election is like it also kind of broke like the usual stereotype of the it's there's these backwards rural voters who's going to screw us over, whereas these urban, these urban residents, these are the progressive Indians who will surely save our country. When in reality, for the most part, it's like kind of the exact opposite. A lot of these like middle class urban Indians are like probably the most pro Modi people, most pro BJP people you'll meet.
No, it makes sense because I think like that cohort is the population that's benefiting from neoliberalism the most directly, right? And I think
exactly.
in rural parts of India, you have societal formations that mirror feudalism more closely, right? Like visited India recently or in recent years can speak to this, where it's like, yeah, urban areas you might be able to get something or delivered through Amazon and you think, wow, what modernity, but like leave the city limits, and especially if you're like in a rural area well between two major industrial areas, the biggest piece of technology someone has aside from their phone is it's not just like, oh, these places are low tech. These are, especially in North India, these are places that have been systemically immiserated by the legacy of colonialism, right? And I think it's, it kind of speaks to the privilege of middle and upper class Indians in urban areas, right? Where it's like you have the privilege to far right nationalists like Savarkar out of context and claim yourself this kind of modern intellectual, and you can enjoy these consumer conveniences of the West like Starbucks and Amazon, but you kind of expect the rest of the country to same conclusions as you. It's entirely bizarre. It's entirely weird.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And I think it's like important to note that even in the urban areas, like really the people who are seeing the most benefit of it is like the upper class, the upper middle class of India, right?
Yeah,
It's not like definitely not the working class. It's very fit, not what you'd like call, I would say, the lowest sort of like people on the like lowest rung of society in the way they're treated, right? It's kind of like these people who I guess, I think this is a term that's overused and somewhat misunderstood, but I guess it's the best way to say it. They're like kind of like the labor aristocrats, pretty much. I would like to say these people
yeah,
are because they
yeah.
more they'll have like a maid as well cleaning their stuff, right? And they'll say like they'll probably take nice trips outside of the country, which is obviously most Indians will not be able to ever like leave India, right? So I think it's like that's the type of voter I'm talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that set of the population is not a majority. They may think that they're the majority because they may dominate discourse and they may dominate media, right? But they still don't. They don't. Yeah, they don't really derive that. And I think you're right to call them similar to labor aristocracy, right? Because a lot of them do appeal to like liberatory nationalist language from like the revolutionary era, right? Often in justified what they're basically asking for is their personal chance to, and this is especially if you've interacted with right wingers from India on any online forum, it's this bizarre idea that like they're going to be accepted by white people as equals. I don't know if you've ever noticed that or if that's one of these people, but that's been like my read of just like you're going to jump from that point to sitting with the West and you get to enjoy the same things they do. And I think anyone who's realistic about these things, let alone someone who has a mature left analysis, understands that this is just not how it works.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I guess bringing it back to an election, another interesting thing, or interesting, I would say, stereotype about like Indians and like Indian voters, especially with the North-South divide, that kind of got broken this election, was the fact that, oh, it's those in like the Hindi belt, those in the North that are the progressive ones, whereas us South Indians are very progressive, right? And that one always especially kind of pissed me off. But that kind of lie has been broken somewhat. Karnataka made a lot of BJP voters there. Kerala, it had its like I think its first MP for BJP from like the state is going to parliament. Tamil Nadu, even though they didn't have a single BJP guy, even though they didn't have a single seat given to BJP in Tamil Nadu, still they made gains. They made voting gains, compared
Right.
to the last few years. So it's this kind of like steady but surely kind of like increase we've kind of seen in parts that were previously thought to be, oh, they're so progressive. There's no way they'll ever win the BJP. That's like the part that I think uh should scare certain people in the South. At least I would say you should be scared because like they're like slowly but surely they've been able to make kind of gains there in recent years. Especially obviously in Karnataka, it's like Karnataka is not really surprising because they recently had a BJP government as of like 2022, right?
Right.
So, or was it 2023? When did they get voted?
I just don't remember when. I'm trying to see.
Well, nonetheless, like this idea of like, oh, us North, very regressive. It's those fucking Hindi speakers that are the regressive us, but us down here in the South, we speak Dravidian languages. We're super progressive. All
It's
loved, by the way, all loved by Dravidian brother and sisters. I love you guys. I love Tamil. I love the people of Tamil Nadu. I love the people of Kerala. You people rock. You make great movies. Your food is amazing. But that whole narrative was bullshit.
all Indians are my brothers and sisters. However, that mentality is like the exact same as like, Americans from the north of the Mason Dixon who are like, we're so much, more progressive than people in the South. And it's like, buddy, the Klan is still running around in Indiana. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, it's because I've been like the person, like I've been so loud about this online, especially. It's like, guys, it's such a bullshit narrative. It's a bullshit narrative. It is no basis in reality. Like we've seen just how right wing you guys can be. Let's look at Karnataka. You know, look how you guys treat migrants from the north. Like I'm not saying we're any better, but like stop it. And it's kind of gotten a little bit exposed, and I'm pretty happy about that. I'm not happy that it happened, but I'm happy that people are starting to come around on the whole mindset. So we can talk about this like adults.
Right. And I think it's, again, these kind of attitudes, like, they do need to be diagnosed and discussed because it's not about who does them. It's the fact that they're being done and that, more importantly, they prevent us from addressing the real problems. It's not about who has more right wingers. It's more about, like, why are these right wing trends popping up in my yard? That's something that if you come from a region with progressive politics, quote unquote, right, that I think behooves people to inquire, right, is like where did this come from? What's causing it? What contradiction, right? And then how do we either keep them at bay or maybe win over? That's like the challenge for politics then, right? But yeah. I completely agree, and I think like it's again it's the same thing where like I've talked about this on this podcast before, where like people from the North in the United States will be like, the South is this inherently racist place, vote for Republicans, and it's like you do know like redlining and gerrymandering are a factor for that, right? Or that a vast barred from voting or suppressed in some way, right? And people tend to shut up when you bring that up, but I always get my share of people who just like double down on like a regional or chauvinist thing, and that's, you know, every one of them. But you're completely right. That's like it's the mentality that's the problem.
Yeah, it's really annoying because, like, especially like the way these places in the South sometimes treat migrant. Like, I'm not talking about like the rich, like or middle class, upper middle class kind of like white collar migrants they get. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about like poor, like dirt
Yeah,
poor
yeah,
migrants. Right? They treat them like shit. It is so well documented how horribly they're treated. You know, and this again, same is true in the North. But my point is to say that like it's not like this progressive heaven down south in India, right? Like they have their fair share of problems, right? But
yeah.
again,
I don't think.
obviously,
Yeah,
and like obviously, you know, like if let's say, you know, gun to my head, if I had to raise a family anywhere in India, I'd probably pick a state like Kerala, right? Because of simply how progressive the sort of government is, obviously being run by a communist party, but also within regards to having like really good healthcare, you know, very good standards of
yeah.
living, you know, all of this stuff like relative to like the rest of India. Like again, this there's certain like roots here, but it's just this like idea that oh, we're inherently more progressive. It's because of us Dravidians. Like it's like people are using borderline race science on me to show that the South was like more progressive than the North. It's like, all right, come on, guys.
Yeah, I think like wherever that shows up, I don't know, because like when people in the North in the United States bring that up, it just reminds me of like liberal fascism to some extent, right? Where it's like we're inherently better, we're inherently like smart. Anyhow.
So I guess going back on topic, I guess I kind of went on a little bit of a rant there
No, you're good.
uh,
You're good.
about that. Yeah. So I guess we should probably talk about the opposition alliance, which is the India Alliance, as well
Yeah,
as the
yeah.
main
Let's get
party
into
of the
them.
India Alliance, the Congress Party.
Yeah, Congress.
So I guess
So
starting out. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying, yeah, Rahul Gandhi's, you know, the beard, he's making a comeback. You know, everyone told us a dynast couldn't do it, but he did.
Everybody said the Italian man couldn't pull it off.
He is the Indian Napoleon. We need to shut our, you know, we need to sit our brown ass down and listen.
So for those of you who perhaps, I'm going to assume that like most of the listeners won't understand like much about like at least the last few years what has happened and kind of the shift that has happened with Rahul Gandhi and like the Indian National Congress. But pretty much coming off 2019, like the opinion of Rahul Gandhi as a leader was like at its lowest point possible. Like they were calling him Papu. They were saying like they were saying like all these things about him. It's like, oh, he's just a failed nepo son. He won't be able to do this. He won't be able to do that. He won't be able to take it seriously as a leader. He's like a son. You know, he's not going to do it. So it was like a lot of shit being said about him.
To be fair, I think the big reason he just kept putting his foot in his mouth and kept making these gaffes that were like easily avoidable perspective.
No, yeah, absolutely. Like again, it's not like it wasn't without merit. There was just some like he was definitely not the uh greatest leader the INC could have put forth, especially in 2019. But point is, like back in 2022, there was a shift. And that was because Rahul Gandhi said, I am going to walk, and that will be how we win back India. And lo and behold, it somewhat worked. So I guess I should again explain. For those of you who don't know, like back in it was 2022, right? Late 2022?
I'd
Or was it
say, yeah.
2021? All right, it was like all right, it was back in like 2022. Rahul Gandhi and the rest of the INC they announced this, and is along with working with the DMK, which is the governing party of Tamil Nadu. For those of you who don't know, he announced this huge campaign he was doing, which is where he was going to walk from Tamil Nadu, Kanyakumari, which is the very end of Tamil Nadu, the very end of
Right.
India. Going to walk from Kanyakumari all the way up to Jammu and Kashmir, and he was a walk across India, where he was going to walk and he's going to stop at key places throughout all of the Indian states. He was going to talk with normal, average people, and he was going to reconnect with Indians. And lo and behold, it did wonders. It did do wonders. His opinion poll, his opinion, his approval rating shot up. Everyone was saying, you know what, maybe he is a leader after all. So it worked. It's crazy, but it worked. And a lot of people kind of attribute that to kind of the big turnaround for the INC in the last few years. And it was that plus in this last year as well, especially in the last few months, he's been doing a really good job, him and the other leaders with INC, hitting the BJP at just how bad they've been on unemployment, how bad they've been on just in general, basic economy stuff, how horrible, despite all this thing they've said, oh, we've made the Indian economy so much better. The Indian economy has been doing shit under Modi, at least the last few years. They've been doing a really good job hitting him on that. The opposition, I was impressed. They did a pretty good, solid job running a campaign. A lot better than I thought they would. That's for sure.
So you are right that Rahul Gandhi himself was able to fix his personal image issues, and part of me always felt bad for him because I don't know, you can always an Indian son being pushed into a certain career direction by his parents. So anyone who calls his mom, foreign, right? That's the most Indian thing that can happen to somebody, is getting forced into a career you had no business being in. But that aside, right? I think he has been able to kind of come out of that PR quagmire from earlier years. This push has also helped the INC with its own image issues, right? Where I think prior to the NDA forming its majority in past election cycles, there were just a variety of corruption scandals and a variety of fails from the INC, right? That I think there back then was called the UPA, if I'm not mistaken, right? So because the UPA was mired in a variety of corruption scandals, whether it was the Commonwealth Games, the 2G scandal, a variety of these things. Do you think that the failures of the BJP in the current term, as well as this new PR push by the INC, has it helped them recover from the legacy of those past scandals, or do those in how the INC is currently perceived?
Well, I think, with this whole corruption, and especially the combination of being one family, which many people have said, it's been one family that's been ruling India. We need to change that, right? I think it's a curse. It's been a curse, I think, for the INC, at least as of late. But now it's kind of somewhat turned into a boon, right? Because even Rahul Gandhi seems to kind of have the self-awareness about his position in Indian politics of being the being the great grandson, the grandson, and the son of prime ministers, right? And kind of seeing he's the next level in the dynasty. But he's also kind of taken upon himself to show listen, I understand your problems. I understand your problems with dynastic politics. I haven't been perfect in the past, but this is a new INC, and you kind of see with the new policies is what you've been pushing forward. Kind of, if you read the INC manifesto, by the way, I was pretty impressed with the INC manifesto. I read it. Again, it's not socialism, but he's bringing it kind of back to Nehruvian social democracy, which has kind of obviously shifted away in the last few decades, mainly due to the neoliberalization of India, with the last INC prime minister, Manmohan Singh, being a huge neoliberal, right? And he's kind of moving away from that. He supports wealth redistribution. He supports further he supports expansion of welfare programs. He's also attacking pretty much the BJP and its sale of public assets, right? So they're he's making a genuine effort, I see, trying to show that I am different. I am, as opposed to what it feels like in 2014 and 2019, where he was just kind of trying to ride the coattails of his family, right?
Right. I think in addition to the INC's ability to claw back seats this cycle, there have been other members of the India coalition that have kind of made a comeback as well. So in Uttar Pradesh, for example, right, you had the Samaj, which is also itself a kind of social democratic party of its own, right? They were able to make a big comeback in Uttar Pradesh. they lost out to the NDA coalition those years, and I think the desire to see them come back. So to see them back on the scene is also interesting, and I think like I'm just remembering a criticism of from the past where basically like they were seen as popular in Uttar Pradesh and they had like a big local majority, even like in the INC years, right? Like I wouldn't say Uttar Pradesh is this entirely had like major strongholds of the Samajwadi Party and then the Bahujan Samaj Party, like a party that was its major constituency was lower caste people, right? So to see these forces come back at electoral level as you know the BJP's initial support because they were the new thing corrupt. It's reassuring and it's also like it changes the game now, right? Because take the anti-corruption angle it's taken in the past, nor can it really take the economic development or the jobs angle it's taken in the past anymore. So people have kind of
You're
wised up.
absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Because like they can no longer run on the, oh, we're not the establishment, we're not the corrupt establishment, we're the outsiders, because they are now the corrupt establishment. So it doesn't work with people. It's like, well, hold on. The corruption is happening in government. You're the government. How can you blame other people that are not in the government for corruption, right? It like all these scandals have just appeared that about outside of like the BJP in like the last few years. There have been so many of them, right? Like people don't
Right.
realize just like it's crazy. Like they somehow outdid the INC in corruption. Like, like I would say that's like a huge feat. They outdid the INC in corruption, right? The BJP is a horribly corrupt party. I mean, to nobody's surprise.
I mean, it should shock nobody with Shah has a couple murder cases under his belt, right? So you don't get very far in Indian politics without being a kind of shrewd operator. And I think like in any, again, the term third world is kind of loaded in the modern context. For a lot of like post Bandung third world countries, right? Corruption is this kind of like, easy write off term that Western observers, and it's not that it isn't a real problem, but the reality of it is that political patronage is just like a reality, right? You know, in the West, you get to call this thing lobbying, right? You get to call it campaign contributions, but I think calling it corruption in the Indian context is this. It's this like beautifully dichotomous thing to me because the nature of it is more frank. Like people are more frank about calling it a bad thing. People are more ashamed to be caught with it in a certain context, but they're also more shrewd about how they do it and get away with it. So that's just that's my digression on corruption as it gets brought up in the West, right? But you are right that like if corruption is the only yardstick for Indian politics, the whole legislature is a rogues gallery at that point. Then, right? So,
Yeah, and I feel like I want to be clear to people here because I feel like I've been talking a little bit very complimentary of Rahul Gandhi and like the INC the past few minutes. I just want to be clear. I still don't like the INC. I still am not the biggest fan of Rahul Gandhi. At the end of the day, they are neoliberals, right? They may be a left wing of neoliberals, right? Maybe they're more social democratic neoliberals, but they're still neoliberals, right? They're far from being communist. I feel like
and the INC historically has made several missteps. Like I think that something that we try to admire the INC's leaders in a historical context, right, is this commitment to multiculturalism and secular this,
or nominally
partition
commitment. Yeah.
yeah, nominally, right? But partition happens on their watch. The invasion of the Golden Temple happens on their watch. The
Right.
whole, it's not to say that it's givable in any context, but the 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 distrust people have of the INC is warranted, right? It didn't come out of nowhere.
Yeah, and I would also just want to go out and say, like, if you're like a Kashmiri, like, of course, like you should hate. Like, we would probably hate the INC equally as the BJP because they've been your occupiers. They've been the government of your occupiers, and the BJP has also been the government of your occupiers. And neither party has ever made an attempt to stop occupying, right? So if you're like on, like, I would say the margins of Indian society, like obviously this election doesn't really matter to you because more or less things will stay the same, unfortunately. Because it doesn't look like the INC is going to end the occupation of Kashmir, or they're going to end like the kind of state terror which has been happening in like cases against like the Adivasi communities in like the name of like wiping out the Naxals. Because obviously that started under Manmohan Singh, right? That whole
Right.
like we were declaring war against like the Naxals when it was really just an excuse to make like land grabs for mining corporations, right? So like a lot of these things, like to a certain extent, it does. Of course, it matters, right? But to these communities, like, why would it matter to them when both parties have been equally complicit in like murdering their people and oppressing them, right?
Exactly. So I guess with that, let's maybe just get into some of the food for thought we got for this one, right? Let's maybe talk on multiculturalism and secularism, right? Do you think it can make a comeback and renewal in India? I know the BJP is still in charge, right? But maybe there's a chance that some of the damage can be undone, right? Could this
Well,
come back and renew? Well, yes. Like I was just gonna ask, like, Why does it matter in the Indian and the international context?
well, in the Indian context, I guess it matters like for the minorities, of course, of India, right? Like it's a fine line between having a party which openly calls you like infiltrators, which is something Modi called them in a speech recently, by the way, versus a party that says, "Hey, let's not," you know, right? It's that. It's like amongst the people as well, amongst the populace, right? If there's a party that's openly saying and openly working with them as they, form lynch mobs and riot mobs against Muslims, versus a party that condemns that and says, no, we will not work with that, then yeah, that matters, right? But I would also be hesitant in ever saying, or in like kind of creating this utopia out of the past that never was, right?
Right.
Because like it was obviously, it was better before and it's worse now. But it was never great, like this whole secularism and multiculturalism in India, there was always an undercurrent of this fascism, that managed to fully bloom with the BJP. There was always that undercurrent. You kind of saw it. You saw it in '84 with the pogroms against the Sikhs after the assassination of Indira Gandhi, right? You saw
Right.
numerous kind of like riots and pogroms that happened against minorities, right? So it's just we have to be careful that we do not want to go back to the Nehruvian past. It was not a golden age and it was not perfect. And I think a lot of it was built out of these fantasies about what we need to do is we need to go forward and we need to build a new society, a society that is actually accepting of everyone, a society which is, surprise, surprise, a socialist one, an actual socialist one, not a social democratic one, a socialist, right? And I think that that's what we need to work towards. And I think that we have to be careful not to make a fantasy of the past and say, like, it was better, but it wasn't perfect. And it kind of laid the foundations for what is happening currently, right?
I completely agree with that analysis of it, right? I think especially among like a certain kind of liberal Indian, for latter term, right? Like there is a tendency to romanticize these syncretic aspects of a culture that come out of, India's unique diversity, right? And these real examples of intercommunity harmony, intercommunity dialogue, and arts, society, culture. Like I'm a big fan of like Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, things like that, right? But you're also right that like fetishizing those things only papers over like real societal contradictions, right? And those contradictions fuel communal violence, and those contradictions are exploited by the right wherever these contradictions exist, not just in India, but in any context. You see the American right exploits these quote unquote underlying contradictions of diversity in America, right? And things like, our convenient narrative of the melting pot, which it's still a beautiful idea, right? But it doesn't, it's like an imagined, society, right? It's not one that accounts for the complexity of our society, right? So embracing complexity and moreover having a system that can handle it rather than just patronize these things, I think you're spot on with that.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's also just get into like, wait, go ahead.
I was just saying, like, I guess in terms of like the international context, like, what would you mean by that? I guess, like, how would it matter on like the international sort of stage, like whether it's like a sort of openly fascistic government versus like kind of a government that isn't? Is that what you mean? Or is that
That,
what you
that's
mean by
kind of where
question?
that's kind of where I was getting with that, right? Because I think like, you see like we I was talking about this on a previous episode where like I think the global discourse, the global political discourse about borders, migrants, refugees, immigration has kind of been shaped by experience of the Syrian refugee crisis, right? And I think
Right.
the angle that the European right specifically took, right, has set the tone for how right wingers kind of globally are approaching the issue. And you see it in aspects of like, and how they're discussed in India, in that specific context, right? But there's been this recent push those years onwards to kind of label multiculturalism, integration, diversity, whatever you want to call it, right, as this kind of failed liberal invention, and in reality, there's only separate peoples and that they exist in conflict with one another. That's the way the right presents it. And then the really insidious angle that European right wingers have taken that Americans took in response as well, and you kind of see that in how the Trump years played out, is that, you know, racial homogeneity is how you prevent the social contradictions caused by new forms of diversity in your society. That right has presented it. So I guess maybe I answered my question with that, right? But I think like, if one place can successfully fight back against these narratives that different people cannot live amongst each other, different people cannot have common goals, different people cannot live peacefully, right? And can kind of prove that perspective wrong, it can create the momentum to do similar things around the world. But at the same time, like you're saying, do it with, rosy images of, people holding hands of different backgrounds. It has to be based on societal systems and orders that adequately deal with contradiction head on rather than paper them over or exploit contradiction.
Yeah, I completely understand what you're saying, and I think you're absolutely right about that. But I think one thing that I was just thinking about in terms of like how would it matter in international context is I
Right,
think
right.
obviously with the BJP coming to power, and this is kind of actually predates the BJP. I think it happened in the 90s and 2000s with INC governments, obviously with Rao in 90s and in the 90s, and then Manmohan Singh in the 2000 early 2010s, where it was kind of the shift away from this third worldist Bandung view of the world, sort of like
Yeah.
international solidarity with the oppressed, no matter what, right? Just keep in mind that was kind of at least nominally the position that India held for ever since post independence, right? Nehru famously said to I think it was I can't remember. I think it was like the American leader or American ambassador or whoever, but he famously said that my sympathies fully lie with the African people, when talking about
Mhm.
American colonialism. They absolutely refuse to recognize their the passports would not go to apartheid South. They would not work. They would. You could not go to apartheid South Africa or the Republic of Rhodesia, which, for those of you who don't know, is a white supremacist republic, a
Right.
short-lived white supremacist republic, right? In now it's called Zimbabwe. Um, so there was this kind of third worldist politics that was very, very prevalent in India, especially if you look at their support for Palestine, which was very present, right? And obviously now that has been changed in recent years as they formed close military alliances, particularly with the buying of Israeli weaponry, right? And I
Right.
think at least Rahul Gandhi is trying to kind of move towards that, at least from what his manifesto said. And I know the INC has openly criticized the BJP government for its like close ties with Israel and its like refusal to condemn them for genociding the Palestinians in Gaza right now.
Hmm.
So I think that's something that needs to be brought up, of course.
That's actually, it's great that you brought that up. I even failed to consider it that way. So in that vein too, I guess I wanted to ask you maybe about like the limits of diaspora perspective. Me and you have talked about this before. I don't know how deep we can get into it now, but this phenomenon of Indian Americans in this particular case, people who are liberal in America but support Modi. What's the glaring contradiction here that no one wants to bring up?
Well, I mean, of course, it's kind of like, well, the reason why they're liberals in America, of course, like why many sort of like, Indians who otherwise would be right wing in India, the reason why they're liberals in America is because they kind of have a good understanding of where they're wanted, right? Because, like, very clear, like, I've talked to many Indians about this, many immigrants, they said, well, it was very clear that I was not welcome in the Republican Party. Like, they were just openly racist, right? So whether I agreed with them on economic policy or things like this here and there, whether I was quote unquote physically conservative, it was very clear I just was not welcome in that space. So that immediately turned them off, right? And that kind of experience as like an immigrant in America and being brown and having facing racism, right? That kind of led them to have, and of course, again, there's so much racism amongst the diaspora against other minorities. Like, I mean, that goes without saying. But to a certain extent, that would lead them to be more supportive of, let's say, um, movements like the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And movements against racism, against the Hispanic community, against other Asian communities, right? It's like that kind of understanding. But at the same time, a lot of these immigrants coming from India are also come from a privileged background. They tend to be upper caste. They tend to have come from like very upper middle class, if not outright bourgeois families, right? And because of that, their interests would kind of align with what the BJP is pushing forward, or would align with like what the BJP is pushing forward in terms of their economic policy, which favors obviously the bourgeois.
I think that's spot on, and I think like that's just the truth in this that no one wants to admit, or maybe people just don't see. Right? Is that these categories of identity are never flat, nor can they be flattened. They're kind of perpetual through someone's life, and they affect how people act and how they perceive things. Like there's that quote from Mao that I think about a lot, where it's like everyone has a perspective that is a consequence of their class position. And the quicker someone understands that, the more people's actions and thoughts make sense. I'm I'm heavily paraphrasing that quote, right? But it's it's one of those quotes that like is really effective at kind of explaining political ideology much more efficiently than Zizek dreamed he could, right? anyhow.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Anand, this has been a great discussion. We've been at this for, I think it's an hour and a half.
It
Um,
it has been an hour and a half.
yeah, so I'm down to keep going, but we got to wrap this up eventually. So, any
I
closing
actually think
thoughts or
uh closing thoughts.
yeah,
Huh. Well, I don't know. I guess as with all things, I think we need to remember what Gramsci said, right? Uh, optimism of the will, pessimism of the intellect, right? We should never give in to hubrism. And like, even though like it was somewhat sort of positive this last election, we also need to always remain steadfastly critical, and we should also remember that it's not over, right? The BJP still formed the government, and so the opposition needs to just be relentlessly critical of the government of the BJP government, and they also need to keep on pushing forward, right? Because the last thing they should do is like let their guard down.
I
I
completely
guess that
agree
was
with
a,
that.
a bunch of
Yeah.
things put together.
No, that's good. That's great. It's solid, and I think once again, right? Like I think it's always refreshing for me to talk to other diaspora folks who have a cogent and mature, left analysis, right? There's such surface level chai tea discourse you can take before you start to feel alone, right? And I think having, the chance to talk to somebody about this and for this discussion to be good for both of us, but also like, we've kind of deciphered some of this, or like this has been really good, and I had a lot of fun talking about this with you. So thanks for coming on.
I had a lot of fun as well. Thank you so much for having me on. Oh, should I plug my Twitter?
Yes, please do.
All right, my Twitter is decrepit zoomer. So if you like to see mediocre shit posting, uh, from somebody who posts like very infrequently, definitely follow me. Yeah, that's it.
I'll have the link to your as well as our show and all our other links in the show notes as well. This has been another episode of Greenhouse Gaslighting. Thanks for tuning in, dear listeners. We'll see you on the next one.
फिर आया है टाइम टू चूज who will screw us more. चुनाव का महीना है मच गया शोर फिर आया है टाइम टू चूज who will screw us more. ऐसा गया है ये डिस्कोर्स नीचे गोत्र जनेऊ वर्सेस हेट की स्पीच ऐसा गया है ये डिस्कोर्स नीचे गोत्र जनेऊ वर्सेस हेट की स्पीच कोई बोले पप्पू कोई चौकीदार चोर आ गया है टाइम टू चूज who will screw us more. चुनाव का महीना है